Hello and welcome to Masculinities, Liberation Through Photography at the Gropius Bau in Berlin. Masculinities, Liberation Through Photography is a show that explores how masculinity, how the male identity, the male gender has been socially constructed, coded and performed through photography and film from the 1960s through to the present day. The genesis for this show really comes about at a time where we're living through a moment when we're seeing the rise of what I'm calling a masculinist nationalism, this idea that these strong male leaders are shaping their image according to very retroactive ideas of what it means to be kind of the tough, hard male, set against the backdrop of the kind of Me Too movement, this re-emergence of a kind of a gender war. And so that really serves as kind of the backdrop partly to the show. The title of the show is called Masculinities, Liberation Through Photography. The reason that we've chosen to call the show Masculinities is that we really wanted to underscore the plurality of what it means to be male today, a performative aspect of identity, the fact that identity is something that's unfixed, it's performative, and it is engineered or conditioned according to very specific social constructs. The show is divided into 6 very kind of thematic, separate sections. The first chapter in the show is titled Disrupting the Archetype, and the idea is that we were looking at artists who, throughout time, but particularly in the post-war moment, have really sought to destabilize, disrupt very narrow definitions of what gender, identity, and sexuality mean. They're trying to break through of that. And so the artists in Disrupting the Archetype are looking at these kind of heroic ideas of masculinity. So we're looking at subjects such as the soldier, the kind of military masculinity, but we also look at bodybuilders, wrestlers, cowboys, and obviously athletes as well. They perform on the field, on the pitch, and it's this arena or theatre where masculinity performs itself. So all the artists in that section are really looking at how have subverted those ideas. They're trying to disrupt these kind of very cliched stereotypes of masculinity. The exhibition begins with a very important work by a British-born artist called John Copeland, who emigrated at quite a young age to the United States, and in fact he went on to co-found Art Forum. So he was first and foremost a critic and a writer, and in the later stages of his life he began to forensically explore his own body and his own masculinity. And really what we're looking at with John Copeland, so these very large monolithic kind of photographs of his body where his face is cut off, it's always honing in on aspects of the kind of fractured body. But what we're really looking at is this idea of aging, and aging within masculinity is often seen as a loss of masculinity. You begin to lose this idea of the kind of the physical strength and aggression and assertiveness that comes through the body. And it's a wonderful work, and I'm so pleased that the show opens with that work, because what we really wanted to do from the get-go is to say, actually, you're not going to see images of very buff bodies, although of course those images are also included in the show, but the idea was that from the get-go we wanted to disrupt, disturb, so you're coming into a show that's going to question ideals of masculinity. The second body of work in the section that I want to draw your attention to is a work by Thomas Dwarnik, who is a German photojournalist. He was in Afghanistan following the 9/11 attacks, and he was embedded with a military unit. He travels to Kandahar, where he comes across a number of photo studios. You need to bear in mind that photography was banned under the Taliban regime because it's seen as being iconoclastic. However, they soon realized that they needed to have some photo studios open in order to take photographs for ID purposes, passport photos and so on. And in the back of these photo studios, what Thomas Dwarnik came across were abandoned photographs of the Taliban soldiers that had been made covertly, discreetly, of them performing to the camera. These are vernacular photographs. They perform their own identity to camera, and I think that's a really important aspect of this. They apply kohl to their eyes, they hold flowers, or they're holding guns in their hands, and they deliberately disrupt our ideas of what we perceive, particularly in the West, to be ideas of Taliban soldiers are seen as being repressive, oppressive, misogynistic, patriarchal, very male-dominated society. And from that section, we move on to another section which is titled Male Order, Power and Patriarchy. And this section is really looking at the unequal power dynamics, both between the genders, so between men and women, but also importantly within the genders, because there is a hierarchy of male identity upon which sits the kind of white heterosexual male, this kind of very traditional idea of the male authoritarian patrician-like figure. And below that, there are various kind of marginalized masculinities, those that don't have a platform or a voice. And we're showing work by Richard Avedon, Piotr Uklansky, and many others, but I also want to talk specifically about a body of work by an American artist called Karen Orr, who's been based in the UK for many, many years. She made a work in the very early 1980s in the UK called Gentleman, where she photographs inside all male private members clubs in St. James's in London. St. James's is this kind of area that's associated with political power. And so she gains access to these male-only spaces. There's lots of paintings of noblemen and former, those that held power through the decades, through the centuries. So this idea that male authority is something that's almost like a divine right. She takes these photographs of these men. They look quite naturalistic, but in fact, they're very artfully directed photographs. And alongside these photographs, which are black and white, there are very kind of short texts that anchor the work. And these short texts are composites from conversations that she's overheard, from newspaper articles and so on, that are reflecting on how not only women, but other marginalized masculinities have been excluded from the corridors of power. It's a very sardonic, humorous, playful work with a really, really important political message in terms of gender equity, but also equity within the male gender as well, which I think is really important. The third section of the show takes a very different tack. It's really looking at much more kind of intimate, tender ideas of masculinity. It's a section that's called Too Close to Home, Family and Fatherhood. And it's really kind of focusing in on the messiness of life. So fatherhood, familial relationships, brotherhood, intergenerational male bonds and so on and so forth. You know, we no longer live in these very kind of nuclear traditional families of a mother and a father and two children. You know, we live in a world where there's collaged families and blended families. So it's really trying to prize apart how we've come to think of the family, and particularly fatherhood as well, this kind of disciplinarian figure. But I want to talk about a really kind of humorous work. There's a lot of humor throughout the show. I think it's really important. Humor can be seen as something that's pretty subversive and transgressive. And so there's a series in the show by a Dutch conceptual photographer called Hans Eichelboom, who made a work that's made up of 4 black and white photographs from 1973 titled With My Family. And in it, what we see is the artist, Hans Eichelboom, standing in as an authentic father figure, this surrogate father in other people's family portraits. The story goes, it's a bit of a myth, that he knocked on the doors of families in a residential area of Amsterdam, and when he thought that the husbands would be out at work, so this idea of the breadwinner, and the women would be, as the caregiver, at home raising their children. He knocks on the door and says, "Can I take a photograph of the family?" And I'll pretend to be, the father figure. He's quite a handsome young man, and he comes across as this very authentic and really convincing father figure within these photographs. But what's interesting is that he exploits these kind of gender expectations, this idea that the father will be out at work and the mother being the carer of the children. It's also reflecting on this idea of the absent father, the father figure that kind of exists in this kind of mythic space, but is often very distanced, both physically and metaphorically from the family as well. So there's lots of things wrapped into this very kind of humorous and playful work. And then the 4th section in the show is titled Queering Masculinity. It's the second largest chapter of the exhibition, and that's really looking at how artists, particularly queer artists, forged a new politically charged queer aesthetic from the 1960s through to the present day. I want to particularly focus on the work by Peter Hujar. We're showing 13 prints by Peter Hujar, taken from various portfolios within his wider practice. So Peter Hujar is an American artist, very active during the 70s and 80s. He was a downtown cult figure. He was a one-time lover and lifelong mentor of David Wojnarowicz, very dear friends with Susan Sontag. He was a really important cultural figure. And this is kind of a pre-AIDS moment as well, which I think is really important to remember. But also we need to think about the fact that this work was also coming out of the countercultural revolution moment, the women's lib movement, the sexual liberation movement, and this idea that gay rights, queer rights were beginning to have legitimacy and visibility out in the streets. And I think the politics of that, the social context of that is really important. So Peter Hujar takes these beautiful photographs down alongside Christopher Street Pier. Christopher Street is well known as being the site of the Stonewall riots, and Christopher Street had become this hub of not necessarily experimental or alternative lifestyles, but a space of freedom, of liberation, where you could be who you wanted to be. It felt like a safe space. And he goes down to Christopher Street Piers, which were really seen as these cruising joints where men of all creeds and colours came together to flirt with each other, to display, almost like a peacock, to kind of display themselves, to attract mate. And he takes these very beautiful photographs of men's legs, or just men hanging out, cruising, for want of a better word, but they feel like a really safe space. I mean, Christopher Street Piers was dubbed the sex pier, so you knew why you were going there. Particularly if we think about when they were taken in the 70s, that it was an incredibly liberated space as well. Then we're going on to a very different section of the show, a section of the show that I think has taken on a lot of prominence and resonance in this moment of Black Lives Matter. And it's a section of the show called Reclaiming the Black Body. We felt it was really important to focus in on how artists, whether they're persons of colour from America, so African American artists, Black British artists, but also artists from across the African continent, were self-representing. How are they reclaiming their image? The black body has often been fetishized by Western artists. So we've got artists, the Cameroonian artist Samuel Fosso, the Angolan artist Kilawanji Henda. We've also got the African-American artist Hank Willis Thomas. He's much more of a kind of photo-conceptual artist, and he has made a series called Unbranded, Reflections in Black Corporate America. There are 82 prints in the totality of the series. We are showing about a dozen. And what he does is he has trawled through magazines made or published between 1968 and 2008. 1968 is important because it was, of course, the height of the civil rights struggle, but it also marked the moment of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And 2008 obviously marks the ascendancy of Barack Obama, the first African-American man to become a president in the United States. So those two important historical moments really bookend this body of work. And what he does is he trawls through all of these magazines, he selects images, and then he digitally strips them of all of the advertising texts and slogans and branding that would have been on these images that tell us how to read that image. And very often these images were made by white male advertising executives to speak to an African-American audience. So we're looking at how the African male experience has been commodified, how it's been targeted. But by stripping away, what we begin to see are the cultural stereotypes, the racial stereotypes that are embedded in how we read these images. And then the final section of the show is titled Women on Men, Reversing the Male Gaze. And it's really looking at women artists from the 60s and 70s onwards. They were kind of turning the lens, reversing the male gaze, as it were. So we've got works by Laurie Anderson, Annette Messager, Anna Mendieta, amongst others. But in the show, we're showing the work of the German artist, Hamburg-based artist Marianne Wex, who in 1977 published a book called Let's Take Back Our Space. It's like an encyclopedic body of work where she collected images, which she kind of cut out from newspapers or magazines or history journals, where she looks at how men and women have got their physical behaviour, so how they sit, for instance. So it's kind of a compare and contrast exercise that she goes through, and she puts together the women are always shown at the lower part of the frame and the men are always shown at the top half, which again is about hierarchy as well. Women often sit with their legs closed or crossed, and of course men sit with their legs man-spreading. So she's already coining the term man-spreading long before it was invented. And it's this compare and contrast scenario where she's looking at how, not only how much space literally men and women take up, which talks to how much space we think we deserve or own, and so on and so forth. And it's incredible, to think that she was astute and avant-garde in her ideas around kind of the performativity of identity back in the 70s. And it's an incredible body of work, so please do come and see it. Thank you so much.